Hey, welcome back to Jet Lag, the podcast all about TCKs and what it's like to grow up overseas. I'm your host, Noah, and today I'm joined by your co-hosts, Elizabeth and guest, Silas. Thanks for joining us as we discuss today's episode, Culture Shock. Okay, so Elizabeth, what is culture shock?
The way I think of it is it's when your normal is disrupted by going to a different place or country. And so the things that you've taken for granted are no longer guaranteed. It can be culture related, such as like greeting people or etiquette, but it can also talk about like it can be differences with, for me, when I go to the store or even the weather.
Okay. Do you have anything to add, Silas?
So culture shock normally, like, it relates to cultural, like Elizabeth said, with etiquette and those types of things. But it can also relate to language. Language, it's normally referred to in the same genre as culture shock because language and culture are so tightly connected.
Yeah, I think for me, like, I guess when I have culture shock, it's mainly like dealing with the people. I mean, like culture in general, just like with the cultural, the culture of the people, if that makes sense.
Trying to understand people.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. How does like culture shock, how long does cultural shock last for you, Silas?
Normally, so for most people, through a full thing of culture shock, it'll normally last 6 to 8 months.
Okay.
And it might be faster if you know that culture and you're just readjusting back into it.
Yeah.
But often it's really subtle. There are some parts that you notice that stand out a lot, and that's normally towards like the middle of it. But like if you're adjusting to an entirely new language and culture, especially culture, it would take normally, I'd say maximum probably 6 months.
Okay, cool. Elizabeth, do you have any thoughts?
Especially when I go back to America or a country that I've lived in, it's probably a week where I am full on noticing all of those differences and I'm really attuned to, oh my gosh, this is so new and different. But then after that, it fades. And so then I'm probably going to just, I don't know, I'm adjusted, but then there's still going to be moments where I'm confused or just, I don't know, noticing the differences.
Yeah. So, do you want to add anything?
Normally it'll be like, for me at least, it'll be like, why did that person do that? Like, why did they say it that way? Why are they abrupt in this way? Or why do they take longer to come across with that point?
Yeah. So for you, what is culture shock like? Like, what does it feel like for you, Elizabeth?
When I go back to America, it's really disorienting, but for me, it's also a little exciting because I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm back. Like, this is different, but I'm not used to this anymore, but I was used to this, and I'm trying to get back to it. But if it's a completely new culture, it can feel very confusing and kind of disheartening. Like, I don't understand this. This is so frustrating. So there can be a lot of different emotions associated with it.
How about for you, Silas?
I'd say something similar to what Elizabeth said. With everything is new, and you're wondering like what's going on.
Yeah.
What's happening, especially if it's a new language. And I feel like it does speed up a little bit as you get used to hopping back and forth between cultures. So like TCKs like us, we're faster at adapting compared to others.
Yeah, no.
Because we've grown up doing it.
Definitely. Okay. What is the hardest part about having culture shock, Silas?
I'd say the hardest part of having culture shock is trying to understand why people do things the way they do them. Why they go about things. So someone who is newer to a culture will go about and wonder, why do they say it this way? Why do they go about saying hello this way? Or why do they go about doing a business agreement this way? And it might come across as, like, because of the way different cultures are, they might think that they're being pushed away or other stuff just because of miscommunication between different cultures. So oftentimes it's a lot of confusion.
Yeah. How about for you, Elizabeth?
It's most frustrating for me when I'm trying to relate to a person and that culture shock is a barrier between us. So a lot of what Silas was saying, just like when that is what's keeping me or preventing me from doing the things that I want to do in the most effective way possible or just understanding people.
Can you share some specific memories of culture shock that like are specific to you or funny? Because we've kind of talked about culture shock and like how it's disorienting and stuff.
Well, we talked about this a little bit in our China episode, but when people in China, when they offer something to you, you have to say no 2 or 3 times.
Yeah.
And then after you've said no 3 times, if they're still offering, then you can accept it. So I'd go back to America and people would offer something to me and I would be the polite person that I was and I would say no. And then they'd ask again and I'd be like, oh, no, thank you. And then they'd stop asking and then I wouldn't get it. I'm like, oh, no.
I really wanted that.
Bummer.
And you didn't ask me again. So
another kind of silly example is whenever I go back to America and I go to the supermarket, I am overwhelmed by how many options they have with literally everything. Also, here in Georgia, they have much smaller quantities of something. So the peanut butter is in these teeny tiny little jars. Glass bottles. The peanut butter is in glass bottles. And you go back to America and they have these massive things of peanut butter and gallons of milk. You don't have gallons of milk here. And so I remember I came back to America and I opened my grandparents' fridge. This is 5 minutes after coming into my grandparents' house. And I'm like, oh my gosh, there's gallons of milk. This is so massive. And then I was talking about the cereal and I was just talking about all of these products that we don't have in Georgia. So that's the first example that comes to mind. My cousin was just looking at me like, what? And I was also talking really high pitched and I was jet lagged and all that. But that's the example that comes to mind.
Silas, do you have any examples that you would like to add?
For me, big example has been actually in stores. So where we lived, if someone asks you how you're doing, you answer and tell them how you're doing, and then you ask them, how are you doing? And you have a conversation about it. We're at a store in America, and I had someone ask me, oh, how are you doing today? Which is the polite thing to say in America. And my response was, I'm doing well, and I told them all the things I had done that day and asked them, how are you doing? And
oh my goodness. That's really funny.
Yeah. And also, coming from Tanzania, which is where we were, people are very abrupt in America. And then Americans like to say that Germans are very abrupt. So I'm glad that we didn't go to Germany on our way to America.
Yeah,
but
no kidding.
Just Americans in conversation, if they're saying something, are a lot more blunt with how they say it or how they come across with a point comparatively to where we were. In Tanzania, you could spend 2 hours talking with someone to get to a point. In America, you'll have a conversation for like 5 minutes and then you'll ask them the question.
Yeah.
Yeah. In China, this is sort of like what is in Tanzania, but in a different way. So they would be very indirect. So in China, if the host is cold, they will say, hey, are you cold? Can I turn on the heat for you? Whereas in America, you would say, oh, I'm cold. I'm going to turn on the heat. Yeah. Something like that. And so that happened a lot in China. And then my dad, he slowly got adjusted to, and I'm sorry, Dad, if I'm getting this wrong, I apologize. But I feel like I've heard you say this before. He got used to the indirect culture in China, and he got really attuned to it. But then he came back to America, and he would be indirect, and nobody noticed. So he had to retrain himself to be direct again.
That's really funny.
There was a moment with my dad like that, where we walked into a Chipotle right after, like, coming from Tanzania. We didn't have Chipotle in Tanzania. So whenever we went back to the States, that was, like, my mom's, like, favorite restaurant. So we would go there and we'd get burrito or whatever on our way to our Airbnb or apartment. And my dad walked in and the lady said, hello, sorry, we cannot help you. We need you to order online. My dad coming from Tanzania, that's not how you do things. And my dad, like, didn't have anything to say. He was just like, what's going on? What is happening? Why are people being mean? I didn't do anything. What did I do to make them angry at me? You know, because that's like what it would be like in Tanzania if someone was angry at you, is they'd come across at that point that way.
That's funny. Some of the things that I guess they're not like, I don't know, but like that are shocking to me is drive-thrus, because in China, you didn't have drive-thrus. You had to go in, you had to order your food, you had to sit down, you had to wait for it. But then in America, especially with Chick-fil-A, you just go in and 5 minutes later you get your food. You get your, like, and then, I mean, like, drive-thrus are still nice in, like, other fast food restaurants. Like, but, like, you get your food so fast compared to, like, when you're sitting in a fast food restaurant or a place in, let's say, China or even here in Georgia. It takes forever. Like
5 to 10 minutes.
Well, yeah, but, sometimes, but, like, we were... After a meeting we had, we went to McDonald's, and it took 45 minutes to get our food. But like, whereas in America, it would take like no less than 10 minutes.
Or 5.
Yeah, well, it's
depending on how busy.
Depending on the restaurant. Another thing, and this is not for specifically me, but like for when people would go to China as a foreigner, or especially as a white person, Chinese people would love to take photos with you. Like they would always be like, hey, can I take a photo with my child with you? Can I take a photo with you? Or can I touch your hair or whatever? Because your hair or the color of your hair or just the way you look is so much different.
Because you're a foreigner.
Yeah, but then Chinese, because Chinese very much like all black hair. Like they just have a very like
similar appearance.
Yeah. So it was always funny like seeing people come from the States to America and all like get all this like photos of stuff with the Chinese locals. My friend in fact made like money off of like he Chinese would like ask him, can I take a photo with you, and he would charge like $1 or whatever, like 6 kwai, and he made so much money off of that. It was cool.
There were many points where in Tanzania, because Westerners are viewed as having money, because you're from the West, you're rich. So everyone would come to us with, and it would be like maybe in some cases like an urgent need or a serious need. But yeah, it's hard in situations like that. Because, you can't do things.
Elizabeth, do you have anything you would like to add?
Not really, no thanks.
Okay, cool. So what does culture shock look for an outsider? Like, if you were experiencing culture shock in America, what does it look like to your family or your friend, for example? Elizabeth?
I think it probably looks odd. Like, it doesn't really make any sense because they're not experiencing the same things. They know their world and they don't necessarily know your world. Or even if they do know the differences, because when I get culture shock, I'm very verbal about it. I get very talkative. Everybody's going to know what I'm thinking and all the differences I'm noticing.
As usual.
Excuse me? Wow, Noah. Yeah, this is why podcasting is great. I just get to talk and people listen to me. So yeah, I'm talking a lot about it, so they know the differences that I'm noticing, but they probably just don't know how different it is. Like, it's so deeply rooted in my mind, and they can see the differences, but not how big they seem to me.
Silas, do you have anything to add?
For me, it depends on the culture that I'm coming from. Yeah. And I think that depends for everybody, but especially like Elizabeth said, you're noticing everything, and depending on how you handle that, people will pick it up as you just being surprised at everything, or being curious at everything, or they'll just wonder why you are interested in everything. I can remember us coming back from Tanzania to the U.S. during the wintertime, and our grandparents, we were like spouting out everything because we just gotten off the plane. You know, we were catching them up on like 3 years of being gone, and them wanting to be with us. And then we got out of the car, and we're just like without any jackets or anything, just messing around in the snow and looking at the snow and talking about the snow, and because you don't have snow in Tanzania.
Yeah, that's funny. I remember also another thing, how like in America they have a lot of canned items and like microwavable
foods,
microwavable food like meals. But like, and they do have some of that here in Georgia, but in China I never saw anything like that. Like you never had frozen pizza, you never had like a frozen steak and mashed potatoes, but like in the States it's everywhere, and then it's like a main meal that I don't really eat it as much, but like I know some people who eat it it's often, and it's just like, dang, that's so easy compared to like actually going to the store and stuff.
Yeah. Compared to China and Thailand and Georgia, America is just so much more convenient. So whenever I go back to America, I'm just surprised by how easy everything is. And not everything is easy in America. There are difficulties to it, but just the ease of living is very different, and that's always surprising to me.
And for me, another thing that like relates it to the people is people get very easy to get used to something that's easy. Yeah. So Americans are like, oh no, I have to do this, and it's gonna take me 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Like, for making a meal, it might take them half an hour. In Tanzania, we didn't even have a microwave. You know, we had to make every single thing from scratch.
Yeah.
Whereas in America, it's like, oh, we need to use our canned corn. There's no such thing as sweet corn in Tanzania.
Yeah.
You just have corn on a cob, and you take it, you have to boil it, you have to do everything with it before you even get to the point of someone who would have a canned thing of sweet corn, you know?
Yeah. Anything that you would like to add on the topic of culture shock?
I think culture shock, at least to me, it can feel kind of lonely and isolating because you're in, especially if I was going to a youth group or just a gathering of people and I'm the only one experiencing this, and the thoughts going through your mind are so different than from what everyone else is, and it can feel lonely. And I think part of that is a lie because people have the capacity to understand more than I think I sometimes think that they do. So I still need to work on trusting people to understand. But yeah, it can feel lonely, especially when you're having that initial reaction to things.
I know for me, I treat a lot of situations where I'm uncertain as if I was going through it in culture shock. I don't know if you guys go through this, but like even when I came to the youth group here in Georgia, I'd been here in Georgia for almost a month at that point, so I was getting more used to Georgian culture. But I got into, or even I'll get into situations where I'll be with people and I don't know those people, or I might know one person, but I don't know anybody else. And I'll sit there and I'll observe and notice all the weird things like I would for culture shock. And then through that, I can blend in.
So you just like sit at like a restaurant and just like watch people?
No, not necessarily
That's
that.
creepy. No.
That's creepy. No. No, but like, I don't know if you guys remember this, but on my first youth group, I stood mostly in the corner.
Yep.
You're a lot quieter.
that.
You are not a quiet person.
No,
you were quiet.
I'm not a quiet person.
I remember
but
that.
at the first youth group, I think I talked with 2 people.
You talked with me like on the walk to
I
the
talked
bus.
with you on the walk after the bus, but like in the youth group itself, I think I talked with Isaiah a little bit, and then obviously Peter. Those were the 2 people that I talked to, and everything else I treated it as if I was doing observation or observing things like I would be during culture shock.
Yeah.
So could you tell us a little bit about like what's going through your mind as you're observing those people? Like how do you consciously go through culture shock?
So saying consciously going through culture shock is really hard for a TCK who goes through culture shock a lot. And at that point you start doing it subconsciously. But you listen, you see the things that you observe, and when you're going through culture shock, you'll think of it as weird, or why would they do it like that? And it's really important to think of it not as weird or what is wrong with these people, but that's different. Why do they do it that way? And try to figure out, or even if there's a motive behind it or not, or like, how does that impact the rest of everything else?
Or like,
because if you think, oh, that's weird, that why would they do it that way? That's stupid. Don't do it that way. You got to do it the way you normally do it.
It's kind of like blocking off a door to understanding them.
To understanding the entire culture.
Really
so you need...
when you really should try to find out. Because it is a cultural norm, generally.
Yeah, because a culture is a collection of things that make it unique. So that one thing connects to everything else. If you miss that one thing, you might be able to blend in a little bit. But if you get it, you'll blend in much more. Just because of how it connects and affects everything else.
Or even not blend in, but just understand them and be able to relate to them and how they process things and how they work as a person.
Because a culture entirely affects how someone thinks.
Yes.
And does things in day-to-day life.
Anything else you all would like to add?
I think we've about covered it. It was a great
cool.
episode. All right. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Jetlagged. Thank you to Noah for hosting this episode. Thank you to Silas for joining us. And thank you to Kian for his fabulous editing and producing and technical work, which I will never understand.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. As it was good.
Well, that was a bad ending.
No.
What?
All right. Cool.